The war had already swallowed millions. Cities were ash. Fields were graves. The sky itself seemed owned by bombers and smoke. In the winter of 1945, as Allied forces clawed their way through Europe toward Nazi Germany's final defenses, discipline was everything. Fear was everywhere. And desertion, quiet, contagious, dangerous, was spreading in the ranks. Then one rifle cracked. Not on a battlefield. Not in the chaos of a German counterattack. But in a small French village courtyard, where an American soldier stood tied to a post, blindfolded, facing 12 of his own countrymen. The order that sealed his fate came from the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The man who died that morning was Private Eddie Slovic. He remains the only American soldier executed for desertion during World War II. Why, in a conflict that saw massacres, mutinies, mental collapses, and unimaginable trauma, was one frightened infantryman singled out for death? Why did Eisenhower approve the ultimate punishment when thousands of other deserters were spared? To understand that moment, the blindfold, the firing squad, the smoking rifles, you have to understand the fear gripping the American army in late 1944. Because this was not just about one man. It was about an army on the brink. And a commander who believed an example had to be made. Eddie Slovic was not born to be a symbol. He grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in a working-class Polish-American family. His childhood was marked by petty crimes and reform school stints. Nothing violent. Just a restless kid scraping by. By adulthood, he had settled into a modest life, working odd jobs and eventually marrying Antoinette Wisniewski. He was small in stature, unremarkable in presence, and by most accounts, not particularly brave. When the draft notice came in January 1944, America had already been at war for more than 2 years. The beaches of Normandy had not yet been stormed. The Ardennes offensive had not yet erupted. But everyone knew the war would demand more men. Slovic didn't want to fight. He never pretended otherwise. Still, like millions of others, he reported for induction. He went through basic training in Texas. He qualified as a rifleman. He learned to march, to clean a weapon, to obey commands. But there was a difference between training fields in America and frozen forests in Europe. That difference would decide his fate. Lost in France. In August 1944, Slovic arrived in France as a replacement infantryman. Replacement troops faced a brutal reality. They weren't shipped overseas in cohesive units with men they had trained alongside. Instead, they were funneled individually into battered divisions that had already been fighting for weeks or months. These divisions were exhausted. Veterans eyed replacements with skepticism. Many replacements didn't survive their first few days at the front. Shortly after arriving, Slovic's convoy came under artillery fire. Amid the chaos, he became separated from his assigned unit. For 6 weeks, he was attached to a Canadian outfit, performing rear area duties. He wasn't in foxholes under machine gun fire. He wasn't storming fortified villages. When American military police eventually processed him and prepared to send him back to his original infantry regiment, the reality hit him like shrapnel. He would be going to the front lines. And he was terrified. The confession. Desertion in wartime is often quiet. A soldier slips away. He vanishes into the countryside. He hides. Slovic did something astonishingly different. He wrote a confession. On October 8, 1944, he handed a note to a superior officer. It read plainly that he was too scared to serve in a rifle company. He stated that he would run away again if forced into combat. He asked to be assigned to a non-combat role. If that wasn't possible, he declared he would desert. He signed it. This was not a panicked battlefield flight. It was deliberate refusal. His officers were stunned. They initially assumed he didn't understand the severity of what he had done. They tore up the note and warned him. Return to duty, they said, and nothing further would happen. He refused. He rewrote the confession. At every stage, officers offered him a way out. Destroy the note. Rejoin your unit. No charges. He refused again. What? Some historians suggest he believed prison time was the worst outcome. During World War I, many deserters had received confinement rather than execution. Perhaps he thought he had gamed the system, choosing jail over death in the trenches. So, he misunderstood the moment entirely. The army under strain. By late 1944, the U.S. Army was bleeding. The Normandy invasion had succeeded, but at enormous cost. The push across France was fast, chaotic, and deadly. Replacement systems were overwhelmed. Casualty rates among infantry units were staggering. And desertion was rising. By some estimates, over 20,000 American soldiers were convicted of desertion during World War II. Most received prison sentences. Some were dishonorably discharged. Very few were seriously considered for execution. But context matters. In December 1944, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. American lines buckled. Units were encircled. Panic spread in certain sectors. Rumors of breakdown circulated among high command. Discipline, commanders believed, was fraying at the worst possible moment. The army needed resolve. It needed obedience. It needed soldiers willing to stand in frozen foxholes under artillery bombardment and not walk away. Slovik's open defiance was more than fear. It was a written challenge to military authority during one of the war's most precarious phases. The court-martial. On November 11, 1944, Slovik faced a court-martial. The trial was swift. He had confessed in writing. Multiple times. There was no factual dispute. Only the question of punishment. His defense attorney argued fear, inexperience, confusion. But desertion in the face of the enemy carried a possible death sentence under the Articles of War. The panel deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death by firing squad. Even then, execution was not automatic. The sentence had to pass up the chain of command for review and approval. Many death sentences in World War II were commuted. But this one climbed higher. Eventually, it reached Eisenhower's desk. Eisenhower's decision. As Supreme Commander, Eisenhower carried enormous responsibility. Millions of soldiers operated under his authority. The success of the Allied campaign, and the lives of countless men, depended on discipline holding firm. When Slovik's file reached him in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was raging. American casualties were mounting. Units were under extreme stress. Eisenhower had already commuted numerous death sentences for other offenses. He was not known as bloodthirsty or reckless with capital punishment. But desertion in combat was different. To Eisenhower and other senior commanders, an example might be necessary. If word spread that open refusal would result only in prison time, what message would that send to soldiers freezing under fire? He approved the execution. It was a cold, administrative decision, ink on paper. But it would end a life. On January 31, 1945, in the village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, France, Eddie Slovik was led to a courtyard. He had written a final letter to his wife. He had asked for forgiveness. 12 riflemen were assembled. One rifle contained a blank round, so no shooter would know for certain if he had fired a fatal bullet. Slovik reportedly refused a blindfold at first, then accepted it. He was tied to a post. The command was given. The volley rang out. Witnesses later said the first shots did not immediately kill him. A second volley was ordered to end it. He was 24 years old. The execution was not widely publicized during the war. It was intended as a message within the ranks, not a headline for newspapers back home. Over 20,000 soldiers were convicted of desertion during World War II. Only one was executed. Why Slovik? Because he insisted. Because he put his refusal in writing. Because he would not retract it. Because he chose certainty over fear of the unknown. And because at a moment when the American army felt pressure from every direction, High Command decided one life could reinforce discipline for millions. Debate that never ends. After the war, as stories emerged and records were declassified, Slovik's case sparked controversy. Some argued he was a scapegoat, a frightened young man sacrificed for optics. Others argued that armies cannot function without absolute obedience in combat. That if soldiers can opt out when afraid, the entire structure collapses. Military historians point out that desertion threatens more than numbers. It undermines morale. It tells the man in the next foxhole that commitment is optional. Yet moral questions linger. Was execution necessary? Would imprisonment have sufficed? Was justice applied evenly, or did circumstance seal his fate? Eisenhower never publicly expressed regret, nor did he offer extended justification. The decision was framed as essential to maintaining order in a brutal, existential war. The larger reality of war. War compresses morality. In civilian life, fear is human. In combat, fear is universal. But the line between fear and refusal becomes deadly thin. Slovik was not accused of cowardice in battle. He never reached sustained combat. He was accused of refusing to try. That distinction mattered to commanders. The U.S. military has not executed another soldier for desertion since. His body lay in a French cemetery for decades before being returned to the United States in 1987 at his widow's request. Time has softened judgment but not erased it. Some see tragedy. Some see necessity. But everyone sees the weight of that morning in January 1945. A single rifle crack meant to echo through an army. This was not merely the story of a frightened private. It was the story of leadership under pressure, of discipline in chaos, of the brutal arithmetic of war, where one life can be weighed against thousands. And in that arithmetic, Eisenhower made a choice, one that history still debates. Eddie Slovic was born on February 18, 1920, in Detroit, Michigan, to Polish immigrant parents. His upbringing was steeped in the struggles of a working-class family. His father worked hard, but opportunities were limited. Detroit in the 1920s and 30s was a city of stark contrasts. Industry booming, poverty persistent, neighborhoods crowded. Slovic grew up in a community where young men often found themselves on the margins, either working in factories or skirting the law. From a young age, Slovic struggled with authority. Minor crimes, petty thefts, and brushes with juvenile detention punctuated his adolescence. Teachers and neighbors remembered him as restless and impulsive, often unwilling to conform to rules. These traits, innocuous in peacetime, would later collide tragically with the rigid structure of the military. As an adult, Slovic married Antoinette Wisniewski and attempted to live a conventional life. He worked at odd jobs, scraped by, and tried to keep out of serious trouble. But the draft in 1944 changed everything. Unlike many of his peers, Slovic did not embrace the military with patriotic fervor. He feared combat, not because he lacked loyalty to his country, but because he understood, at a visceral level, his own limitations in the face of organized violence. Slovic was drafted in January 1944, joining thousands of young men thrown into the American war machine. Basic training was physically and mentally demanding. For Slovic, it was a crucible he never fully adapted to. While he could learn to march, clean a rifle, and follow orders, he lacked the instinctive aggression or courage that some soldiers developed under stress. By all accounts, he was a competent trainee, but deeply afraid of the combat ahead. By summer 1944, he was shipped to France as a replacement soldier. Replacement units were a nightmare in themselves. These men were sent individually to already exhausted divisions. Bonds were minimal and trust was tenuous. Unlike cohesive units with shared histories, replacements were isolated. They lacked the camaraderie that often sustains soldiers under fire. For someone like Slovic, this isolation intensified fear, as there was no team to rely on for psychological support in the chaos of battle. Arrival in combat and separation from units. Slovic's initial days in France were marked by confusion. During a convoy, he became separated from his assigned unit and ended up attached to a Canadian formation temporarily. Although this assignment kept him away from frontline combat, it gave him an intimate look at the war's demands. Rear area duties did not insulate him from fear. He witnessed artillery, mortar fire, and the suffering of other soldiers. Each day cemented his dread. Eventually, Slovic was reassigned to his original U.S. regiment, a rifle company preparing for direct combat. At this point, fear became paralyzing. Unlike many soldiers who adapted gradually or drew courage from comradeship, Slovic's anxiety reached a threshold where he could no longer reconcile his survival instinct with military expectation. The written confession. In one of the most unusual moments in military history, Slovic did not quietly desert or attempt to flee in panic. Instead, he did something almost entirely unprecedented. He wrote a confession of intent to desert. On October 8, 1944, he handed a note to a superior officer. In it, he stated plainly that he was too afraid to serve in combat and would desert if forced to join a frontline infantry company. The note was candid, almost naive in its frankness, and its formality meant there was a clear paper trail. Initially, officers tried to handle it without resorting to severe measures. They tore up the note and warned him of consequences, hoping he would reconsider. Slovic did not. He rewrote the confession. Each version demonstrated that this was not a fleeting panic attack but a deliberate act. By placing his intent in writing, he transformed personal fear into an administrative problem for the military. His repeated refusal to comply made his case stand out in a system that generally dealt with deserters quietly. Desertion in context. Desertion was not uncommon in the U.S. Army. Over 20,000 American soldiers were convicted during World War II, though most were given prison sentences rather than executed. Many fled temporarily, were caught, and returned to service. Courts-martial typically evaluated the situation and weighed the soldier's psychological state, previous record, and circumstances before issuing severe punishments. Yet Slovic's case differed. His premeditated confession created an unusual legal situation. He was essentially challenging the army's authority openly. Unlike deserters who hid and fled, Slovik's act was confrontational, written, and traceable. For commanders, this was a threat. If a soldier could openly refuse combat with minimal consequences, what would stop others from doing the same? The army under pressure. By late 1944, the U.S. Army faced enormous strain. Casualty numbers were high. Infantry units were exhausted. The Battle of the Bulge, launched by Germany in December, was one of the largest and deadliest campaigns in American history. Soldiers were freezing in foxholes, ammunition was scarce, and replacements arrived piecemeal. Discipline was critical. Any erosion could have catastrophic consequences. Military authorities understood that morale and obedience were fragile. Desertion threatened not just operational capability but also the cohesion necessary to hold lines under fire. In this context, a single act of defiance, like Slovik's, became magnified in significance. It was no longer a personal choice, it was a potential contagion. The court-martial. On November 11, 1944, Slovik faced a general court-martial. The trial was unusual for its speed. The evidence was straightforward. He had confessed multiple times in writing to intent to desert. The court did not debate his guilt. Instead, it focused on sentencing. Defense counsel argued that Slovik was inexperienced, fearful, and psychologically unprepared for combat. They asked for leniency or reassignment to non-combat duties. But under the Articles of War, desertion in the face of the enemy carried a possible death sentence. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the panel convicted him and recommended execution. Even a death sentence required approval from higher command. Many such sentences were routinely commuted to prison time, especially in a conflict where manpower was precious. Yet Slovik's case reached the desk of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The morning air in St. Marie-aux mines was bitter. Frost clung to the stones. Smoke from distant shelling drifted in from the Ardennes. On January 31, 1945, the small French village became the stage for a moment that would haunt military history. The execution of Private Eddie Slovik was more than a disciplinary act. It was a demonstration of the terrible arithmetic of war, the calculation that a single life could be weighed against the order, morale, and survival of thousands. Slovik's death, unlike most deaths in World War II, was not the product of a battle's chaos, nor the result of enemy fire. It was a deliberate decision made by his own command. It was a reminder that war is not only fought with bullets and bombs but also with rules, punishments, and the cold machinery of military justice. When historians look back at World War II, it is easy to focus on the vast statistics. Over 400,000 American soldiers killed, millions wounded, entire cities reduced to rubble. Within that enormity, one might wonder why a single soldier's fate matters. But Slovik's case forces us to confront the human dimensions of warfare. The personal, the moral, and the tragic consequences of fear and choice. He was not a hero in the traditional sense. He was not decorated for bravery, nor did he charge into machine gun fire. He was a young man, small, unremarkable, terrified of the impossible odds that awaited him on the front lines. And yet, in his fear, he made a choice to confront authority honestly, to write a confession that detailed his intention to desert. That choice, however, sealed his fate. Fear, duty, and the psychology of combat. The fear Slovik experienced is not rare among soldiers. In fact, it is universal. Modern military psychology recognizes that combat is as much a test of the mind as it is of the body. Soldiers confront extreme temperatures, constant danger, exhaustion, and the omnipresent threat of death. The human brain reacts instinctively. Flight is as natural as fight. For many, adrenaline, training, and camaraderie can overcome fear. For others, fear can become paralyzing. Slovik's fear, unlike that of many of his peers, was absolute. Unlike soldiers who ran in panic and were caught, or who froze in the face of artillery, Slovik articulated his dread. He was aware that others might condemn him. He understood the consequences, yet he could not force himself into a rifle company under fire. His repeated confessions and his refusal to comply became both a moral and administrative problem for the army. It is here that the tension between humanity and duty becomes palpable. Military leaders cannot operate in the realm of individual psychology alone. They are responsible for entire divisions, for thousands of lives, for the success of campaigns that could decide the fate of nations. Discipline must be enforced, and sometimes that enforcement is brutal. Slovik's case then stands as a stark illustration of this tension. One frightened man versus an entire army, with a commander making a choice that would reverberate far beyond a single firing squad. Leadership under extreme pressure. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced decisions most civilians cannot imagine. Millions of soldiers were deployed across multiple fronts, casualties mounting, logistics strained, and the enemy still powerful. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted, American forces were under extreme duress. Any breakdown in discipline could lead to units collapsing, soldiers retreating, and lives lost en masse. Eisenhower's decision to approve Slovik's execution was not taken lightly. It was documented and deliberate. In his position, he had already commuted countless death sentences. But this case was different. Here was a soldier who openly refused, who placed his refusal in writing, who defied the very system that depended on obedience for survival. To Eisenhower, the calculus was clear: show leniency and risk undermining morale at a critical moment, enforce the ultimate punishment and demonstrate the consequences of defiance. This decision is chilling, yet it is emblematic of the burdens of command. Leaders in wartime make choices that weigh human lives as variables in equations of survival, morale, and strategic necessity. Few can bear the moral weight of such decisions. A life reduced to symbol. Slovik became more than a man, he became a symbol. The only American soldier executed for desertion during World War II, he represents the extremes to which a military can go to maintain order. He is remembered not for valor in combat but for the stark lesson his death conveyed. For the men in his regiment, the message was clear: refusal to fight could not be tolerated. Discipline was absolute. Morale and cohesion were not negotiable. The army survived in part because soldiers understood the consequences of stepping outside these bounds. In this way, Slovik's death was instrumental, not in the broader scope of the war but in the psychological structure of a single division. Yet this symbolism carries a haunting cost. Slovik's life, fear, and humanity were subordinated to abstract concepts of order and example. His name endures because of this tragedy, not because of acts of bravery or heroism, but because of the profound moral and human questions his case raises. Ethical reflections and historical debate. In the decades since the war, Slovik's execution has been the subject of intense ethical debate. Some historians argue that he was a scapegoat, a convenient demonstration to the troops, chosen not because he was uniquely culpable but because he was isolated and outspoken. Others contend that strict discipline was essential, and that Eisenhower's decision, while harsh, was necessary for the survival of the army during one of its most perilous moments. Psychologists, ethicists, and military scholars continue to analyze Slovik's case. They examine questions of free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of courage. Is it fair to judge a man who lacks the capacity for combat bravery, yet is otherwise a law-abiding citizen, by the same standards as those who thrive under fire? Or is the demand for obedience in wartime absolute, regardless of individual psychology? The debates are far from settled. What remains undeniable is that Slovik's execution forces us to confront the human cost of decisions made under extreme conditions. It is a reminder that in war, moral clarity is often blurred, and the distinction between right and wrong can be cruelly complicated. The human cost beyond the battlefield. Eddie Slovik was more than a symbol. He was a husband, a son, a brother, a friend. His widow, Antoinette, spent decades living with the knowledge of what had happened to him. When his remains were returned to the United States in 1987, it was an act of closure, yet also a stark reminder of the personal toll of military decisions. The psychological cost on soldiers witnessing or participating in his execution was profound as well. 12 riflemen, each with a rifle containing a blank to obscure responsibility, fired into the young man's body. The firing squad followed orders precisely, yet the act of killing one of their own, intentionally, deliberately, officially sanctioned, left marks that could never fully fade. This is the hidden cost of war. Not only the deaths on distant battlefields but the moral injuries inflicted on those charged with enforcing discipline, on families torn apart, and on the collective conscience of a nation. Legacy in military history. Slovik's story endures in military history as a cautionary tale. Military academies examine his case not to glorify his death, but to explore the intersection of law, psychology, and command. They study the mechanisms of discipline, the consequences of fear, and the heavy responsibilities of leadership. The United States has not executed another soldier for desertion since World War II. Slovik's case stands as both precedent and warning. The military recognizes the severity of such punishment and the need for discretion and ethical consideration in applying it. Reflections on courage, fear, and choice. Ultimately, Slovik's story is about the human dimensions of war. It is about fear, courage, obedience, and the cost of choice under unimaginable pressure. It challenges us to ask, what does it mean to be brave? To obey? To survive? Eddie Slovik did not choose heroism. He did not choose death. He chose honesty about his fear, a choice that, in the machinery of war, proved fatal. In reflecting on his life and execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about the demands placed on individuals in wartime and the moral compromises imposed by necessity. In the end, the firing squad's rifles spoke with a clarity that echoes across decades. A single young man was executed to maintain discipline, to set an example, to enforce order in a world gone mad with conflict. Eisenhower's decision was deliberate, calculated, and irrevocable. The act itself was simple, but its implications were enormous. The story of Eddie Slovik reminds us that war is not only fought on battlefields. It is fought in the hearts and minds of soldiers, in the balance sheets of command, and in the spaces where morality meets necessity. It is a story that forces us to grapple with the most uncomfortable questions: the value of a single human life, the limits of obedience, and the price of fear. Slovik's life ended at 24, yet his story has endured for generations. He is remembered not because he achieved greatness or performed heroically in combat, but because his humanity collided with the brutal logic of war. His story stands as a testament to the fragility of life, the complexity of leadership, and the haunting, inescapable weight of choice in times of extraordinary peril. And so, when we speak of World War II, of victories and losses, of strategies and sacrifices, let us not forget Eddie Slovik. Let us remember the man whose fear, honesty, and fate forced a nation, and a military, to confront the profound tension between humanity and duty, choice and consequence, life and death. In the cold French dawn, one rifle cracked and history listened.